Understanding President Carter's fraught relationship with the press is key to understanding his presidency. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk once more with Dr. Amber Roessner about the historical context behind two news stories that exemplify press coverage of Carter's time in office. Understanding this history can uncover a lot about how news media helped to create the uniquely American version of political theater we experience today.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear. The time for racial discrimination is over. That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
The office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
it is a crisis of confidence.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
The Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
Hi, I'm Amber Roessner. I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I wrote a book called Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign that was published with LSU Press in 2020.
Today we wanted to talk about one of the more infamous episodes from Carter's campaign and presidency, the gaffe after the Playboy interview where he said that he had had lust in his heart. So kind of give us the historical overview of what was going on with that, and then we'll dive in a little bit more to understand where his mind was when he was saying that.
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, I think it's really important to keep in context that that interview was a product of a long campaign for the White House. Robert Scheer, who was the journalist for Playboy magazine, had requested, get this, 16 hours with Carter because he was wanting to engage in a long-form piece. And Jody Powell, who's Carter's press secretary, was like, we can give you like 4 to 5 hours over a period of time. And so it's important to keep in mind that that interview is one that took place over a period of time. The last session is the one in which Carter uttered the infamous "lust in my heart" remark. But even that is interesting because you have a moment in which Carter is walking Scheer out of the door of his home onto the porch to say his goodbyes. He thinks he's off the record. And Scheer argues that he's on the record, right? And Scheer, in this final question, last chance kind of moment, comes back again to the subject of religion. Because you see, that's something that journalists had been incredibly interested in, Carter's take on religion, Carter's faith, since really in advance of that North Carolina primary in April of '76. That's when that news peg kind of hit, and largely because Carter's evangelist sister was campaigning on his behalf in North Carolina. So that's how that news peg kind of wangs into the campaign. Hamilton Jordan, who is Carter's campaign manager, famously says that Carter's faith is Carter's weirdo factor. And he says that because he recognizes that this notion of Carter as a born-again Southern Baptist, how foreign to the American people that concept would be. And so journalists had a ton of questions about Carter's faith. And all through the primary season and into that summer in Plains before the official kickoff for the general election campaign, journalists were interrogating Carter's faith in a similar way that they had when Kennedy ran in '60. So in particular, there was this question of, what do you mean you're on your knees praying all the time? How does that impact your decision-making as a politician? And so Shearer had circled back to that question of Carter's faith. Now, Carter, for his part, was translating a biblical passage, Matthew 5:28. In that particular passage, Jesus is translating the 10 Commandments, right? And he likens even looking at a woman with lust in your eyes to actually committing the act of adultery. That's what Carter was trying to get at. He was trying to translate to Playboy's primary audience of white men from the age of 18 to 60. He was trying to translate that passage. And so he did it in kind of a salty, earthy way. And ultimately, that caught everyone off guard. So when he was grilled one last time about his faith, Carter launches into this monologue that ultimately comes to haunt him. And it really is a bit of a sermonette on pride and lust and lying. He says, the thing that's drummed into us all the time is not to be proud, not to be better than anybody else, not to look down on people, but to make ourselves acceptable in God's eyes. And then he continued, I try not to commit a deliberate sin. I recognize that I'm going to do it anyhow because I'm human and I'm tempted. Moments later, he uttered the most controversial words. I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. Christ says don't consider yourself better than someone else because one guy screws a whole bunch of women and the other guy is loyal to his wife. Now, after that moment, he goes on, he clenches his fists, he gestures sharply that he would never engage in the lying and the corruption of Nixon or Johnson. That's the gaffe. The part of that we remember is the lust in my heart remarks. But what was as politically damaging during that moment when it wangs into the campaign during the general election was the fact that he associated in the same sentence Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard M. Nixon. In fact, it had a direct effect. He had a campaign event in Texas just a few days after the Whistle Stop campaign event during which the Playboy excerpt comes out. And Lady Bird, Johnson's wife, was set to meet the plane, and she refused to do so.
This is a critical moment in the campaign, right on the eve of the election. It's not the first friction that Carter has with the press, but how does this event really set up the relationship that Carter is going to have with the press during his presidency?
That's a great question. So first of all, as I suggested, news breaks of this story during what's supposed to be Carter's seminal campaign launch. And reporters get the excerpt. Shearer earlier that day had appeared on the Today Show alongside Judy Woodruff, and they had engaged in a conversation about this particular gaffe, the lust in my heart comments, and the comments around Johnson and Nixon. Reporters, as you might imagine, immediately press Carter to share what he was thinking.
Like, this is the moment they've been waiting for, right? Like, they've been looking for a gotcha on Carter this entire time, and they feel like they finally found one.
Certainly. And Carter immediately takes a play from Nixon's playbook and limits his exposure to the news media. Then, when he's in that airfield in Texas, engaged in this press conference, he suggests that Shearer had taken him out of context with regards to the comparison that he made with Johnson and Nixon. Shearer's like, I have it on tape. So he's caught then. He's caught suggesting that a reporter had taken something out of context that he had in fact said, a comparison that he had in fact drawn, and one that, looking back on history, is fair. Both Johnson and Nixon did engage in lies and corruptions.
But politically not expedient to highlight in that moment.
Politically incredibly inexpedient to highlight in that moment. What is intriguing that he does, he actually gets a group of journalists together in a hotel room and asks for their advice on how to fix it. Now, why is that intriguing or an odd choice? That's the kind of thing that did happen at points in other presidential campaigns. Maybe you would have a candidate and a journalist, and the candidate might be asking for advice on how to manage a storyline, but kind of behind the scenes. This was Carter and Jody Powell, his press secretary, and Ham Jordan, his campaign manager, actively taking journalists into a room and asking for their help to fix it. And in the aftermath of the credibility crisis, the credibility gap that emerged in Vietnam and Watergate, journalists just chafed at this idea. Like, this was not acceptable behavior. And so it was one of, honestly, many attributes about Carter that journalists didn't like. Here are some more. They were shocked at Carter as a candidate that promised never to tell a lie. And as Ken Auletta, who was a Village Voice reporter, explained to the readers of More magazine, they took that as a personal challenge in the aftermath of Watergate to catch him in a lie. Moreover, they really didn't appreciate, as a whole, as a collective, Carter's pious nature, his holier-than-thou manner, as they would say. They also didn't appreciate his interpersonal encounters with them as a whole. So one of the things they didn't like was that his attempts at culling rapport were very transparent. In other words, they could see the strategic nature in it. Then sometimes they could also see his frustration when a storyline wasn't favorable to him. This is something that journalists were hailing Carter as a media genius in the aftermath of his rise from virtual unknown to the presidency. We don't associate Carter with this idea of media genius today. Instead, we would associate Reagan, right, with that moniker. But the difference was, I would say the central difference was the interpersonal ability. Because Carter and his campaign and his Imagecraft team as president, they knew what to do from a media perspective. Where Carter struggled was that interpersonal with reporters. And part of it for him was that he deeply resented having to engage in befriending reporters because he saw them as key political insiders. And he was so anti-establishment. He did not want to be in that inside circle, and he resented having to engage like that.
That resentment really hampered his ability to communicate with the public, to put forth some of his policies, and ultimately the legacy of the presidency in general. So the Playboy gaffe is this sort of signpost thing that we remember most about the transition from the campaign into the early presidency. Let's talk a little bit about a really big news story at the end of the presidency. This one is maybe a little bit less known, but at the time was also a really big story.
Yeah, Killer Rabbit, huh? Yeah, so it's interesting because with regards to the Playboy gaffe, that did live on in the American imagination. Like, it was immediately parodied on SNL and also in editorial cartoons across the country, right? You have Carter lusting upon Lady Liberty. But that's a moment, as a couple of Washington-based columnists suggested later, in which the American public is laughing with Carter. By the time of late summer 79, they're beginning to laugh at Carter as a weak or failed president. So the Killer Rabbit incident. So the context here, you have a staffer at a bar with an AP reporter. They're doing what you do, having a couple of cocktails. The staffer says, I want to tell you this story. Can you believe this story? Carter was attacked by a rabbit when he was fishing back home earlier this spring. And it was true. A swamp rabbit had kind of approached Carter's boat. He had taken a canoe paddle and attempted to kind of fend off the rabbit. He had some photographers there with him. There are some grainy, incredibly grainy images from the encounter. But Carter's staff, when Carter was telling them about this particular incident, didn't believe it initially. They wanted to see the pictures. So there's the news peg, right? Carter's own staff doesn't believe him. That's what that journalist heard. It was just this zany story. And of course, in our news values, we value the zany too, the oddball stories. And so he included it as a note in his Wire report about this incident. And Walter Mears, who was the head of the AP, pulls it out, and it gets picked up immediately. First on radio, then on television. And you have the press, and they're wanting this image. And Carter's White House team, they reject the request. And so in the absence of this image, you have editorial cartoonists that offer the American public with something that ultimately is much more damaging to Carter. It comes in a variety of images, but I think the most infamous one appears in the Washington Post. William Coulter draws it. It is a parody of Steven Spielberg's Jaws poster, and it's called Paws. And it's this rabbit that has fangs and looks like a shark attacking Carter. And the joke is that Carter's scared of a rabbit. And of course, this isn't a fluffy rabbit if you look at the pictures. This is a swamp rabbit. Sort of scary. But still, Carter's scared of a rabbit, right? It becomes the perfect metaphor for journalists. So this wasn't just in the headlines for one day in late August of 1979. You still saw references to the Killer Rabbit all throughout Carter's re-election campaign. You, in fact, even ultimately see editorial cartoons with Ted Kennedy, who, remember, of course, is a Democratic candidate running against Carter as the incumbent. You have Ted Kennedy dressed up in a rabbit costume that looks like the Trix rabbit trying to jump out from behind a tree at Carter. It's this perfect metaphor for Carter's weaknesses in office.
How much of the way that those two stories went down do you think could be attributed to either Carter's mismanagement or really more likely his team's inability to manage the press? Or is there an element here of it's just a part of Carter's personality, as you mentioned earlier, the anti-establishment, where there was just a part of him that really didn't want to play the game? So is it failure of strategy, or is it an incompatibility of personality?
That's a great question, and I would say the latter, that it's definitely an incompatibility of personality, because you can make a really strong argument that Carter had mastered the new rules of U.S. politics, which he engaged in kind of a modified version of showbiz politics by using regional celebrities to endorse his campaign, and very effectively. What he failed to master completely is developing those personal relationships. And I've talked to people about this. Like, so what if a rabbit had attacked a canoe that Reagan was in? And journalists of the era say he would have made a joke of it. Instead of ending up as the punchline of the joke, he would have made a joke of it. And that is one of the ways in which Reagan superseded Carter in terms of his mastery of the media.
When you think of the classic charge against Carter that he was a good man but not a great president, if there is any truth to that, is it fair to say that part of Carter's lacking as a president might be because of his character rather than a deficiency?
There is a tendency to look back and reflect on the presidencies of Jimmy Carter and even Gerald Ford and to say, man, these were good and decent men who helped this country through the aftermath of Watergate. That alone really is a huge success, a huge accomplishment that, quite frankly, we have undercut in the public imagination. That said, I would say that Carter's weakness, and he would see this as his strength. Carter refused consistently to do what was politically expedient. If advisors came to him and said, man, this will help you politically, even if that advisor was his wife, Rosalind, it was dead on arrival. Because that for him was not the most important thing. But in a permanent campaign for the White House, which is what his pollster, Pat Caddell, drafted for him, that's what you have to do. You have to do what's politically expedient. And Carter refuses consistently to do what is politically expedient.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.